I have a story for you guys that's crazy to hear, but it's not shocking if you follow closely U.S. foreign policy. Stories like this sometimes force you to come to some uncomfortable conclusions about the motivations behind U.S. actions overseas. Because it's incredibly hard to reconcile the facts that I'm about to present you with the fairy tale Disney movie idea that is drilled into all Americans' heads that the U.S. only uses its military in the name of good and to fight for freedom and democracy around the world. I'm sure a lot of people in my audience are already informed on politics, so you're already aware that that idea is bullshit. You guys know that the U.S. commits war crimes on a regular basis with no accountability. So like I said, the story will be crazy to hear, but it shouldn't be a huge shock to you. Though it's still chilling to see the lengths that the U.S. government still goes to protect its war criminals and silence the people who are trying to expose the war crimes. Last week, a story came out that got way less coverage than it deserved. The New York Times detailed how a Navy SEAL team were repeatedly blocked from reporting their supervisor for committing war crimes. The supervisor is alleged to have stabbed and killed an unarmed teen captive. He shot and killed a young girl, an unarmed old man, and he's accused of indiscriminately firing into crowds of civilians. So like I said, originally the SEAL team, they were blocked when they tried to report this guy. They were told to, quote, let this go and that it will, quote, ruin your careers. But somehow they were eventually able to get criminal investigations started, which led to the arrest of their chief officer in September. His trial date is set for late May. I want to say that I'm really glad that these Navy SEALs stood up for what is right and refused to look the other way and cover up war crimes. But it still makes you wonder how often incidents like this happen, but instead the team just chooses to protect their own and cover up the torture and the murdering of civilians. The U.S. is militarily involved in at least 8 different countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Niger. How often do you think people have the courage to take on the entire military chain of command in order to initiate war crimes investigations for one of their own? My guess is the overwhelming majority of the time when these war crimes happen, they get overlooked and swept under the rug. It's important to take note of how our government deals with war crimes. There is immense pressure that is put on the whistleblowers who are just trying to follow the law by reporting war crimes and violations of the Constitution so that they can leave it alone and cover up for the war criminals. But there isn't anywhere near as much pressure or energy devoted into preventing war crimes and prosecuting the people who are guilty of them. And this is where people need to take a real critical look at our government. What does it say about us when our default position is to cover up war crimes and protect the war criminals while going after the people who try to expose them? Because you have to understand, it's not just this instance, it's not just this chief officer. There is a culture within the U.S. military of committing war crimes with impunity. That doesn't happen on accident. There have been explicit actions taken by our government that reinforce the idea that it's better to cover up war crimes than to expose them. General Mattis, who Donald Trump picked to be his Secretary of Defense, he was accused of many war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan before he was promoted to Secretary of Defense. He destroyed the entire city of Fallujah, targeting women and children indiscriminately. It was a massacre. He was accused of using depleted uranium as a weapon, which led to birth defects and cancer rates and other medical illnesses going up. Who do you think ended up better off? Anyone who was trying to expose Mattis's war crimes, or the people who helped him cover it up? Gina Haspel was section chief at a CIA black site where they tortured and murdered prisoners. Is she in some prison cell serving out a life sentence for war crimes and violating the US Constitution? No. She is now the CIA director overseeing the entire criminal agency. What's the message we're sending to people in the military and in our intelligence agencies? The message is that if you commit war crimes in service of the US empire, there will be no consequences. In fact, you'll be rewarded. So this gives incentive for more people to commit war crimes. But as for reporting crimes, I can imagine that being more difficult to want to do if the secretary or the director who this investigation will eventually get to is in that position because people help cover up their war crimes. My guess is that Gina Haspel and the people that she's picked to be in CIA leadership have a vested interest in avoiding war crimes investigations, seeing how they could very quickly go from being investigator to investigated. The same for Mattis when he was the Secretary of Defense. That's how our system encourages war criminals, by giving them promotions and ultimately final say on how any future war crime investigations are dealt with. Now compare that to how whistleblowers who expose the war crimes are treated. Chelsea Manning, again, is back behind bars because the work she did to expose US war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iraq and Afghanistan war logs were the biggest dump of military documents in history. And it was very important stuff that we learned from those documents. We learned about Guantanamo Bay and the illegal torture network that was set up by the Bush administration. We learned a lot about that from Chelsea Manning's leaks. We also learned about the US military brazenly killing civilians, including journalists and women and children and medics on the ground, and then laughing about it. She was the one who leaked that video. She exposed the information about how the US was fudging the numbers when it came to civilian deaths, because the way that they were classifying combatants was just complete bullshit. And they would say anybody who was from the ages of 18 to like 50 something or 60, whatever, and you're a male, you are by definition an enemy combatant. So if you die in an airstrike, if you die by a drone strike, if you die in a raid, we're not going to count that as a civilian death. We're just going to say you are the enemy until someone proves otherwise. When that information that Chelsea Manning leaked to WikiLeaks was made public, it was a bombshell, because now people were starting to see what was going on in the war that the government was lying about from the very beginning. How was Chelsea Manning repaid for that? She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. She was tortured and ultimately served 7 years of her sentence before Obama finally commuted the rest of it. Chelsea Manning tried to follow the rules. She tried to report the disturbing behavior that she saw and the documented war crime that was on her desk. She tried to report it to her superior officers, and they swept it under the rug. Just like what happened to this Navy SEAL team. But again, this was just Chelsea Manning, a private in the Army. She didn't have the backing of an entire Navy SEAL team. So her only other option was to bring these documents to WikiLeaks so that they could make them public. And because of that, she was smeared, she was called a traitor, her reputation destroyed, her career destroyed, and she was locked up and put behind bars and sentenced basically for the rest of her life. But here's the kicker in that Chelsea Manning story that almost nobody likes to talk about. Even though she provided verifiable proof of war crimes, some cases video evidence, critical information that she felt that she needed to get out to the public, and honestly those leaks changed the discussion that a lot of people were having about the Iraq war. Even though those leaks did not harm anyone, she did not leak the nuclear codes, she leaked evidence of war crimes. She was the one who got the 35-year sentence. She was the one who was tortured. What happened to the people who were on video and audio tape committing war crimes? Not a goddamn thing. Not a single war crimes prosecution for any of those people. None of them were tried for murder or anything. And that's the point that I'm getting at. The point that I'm trying to make is this culture did not just appear out of nowhere. Kyle Kulinski from Secular Talk used to make this great point about civilian casualties. Maybe it's an accident the first time you kill scores of civilians in an airstrike. But when you do the same thing every day of the week and take no actions to prevent this from happening or hold anyone accountable when it does, the only logical conclusion is either you're insanely incompetent or you just don't actually care about civilian casualties. Now, in the context of this story, if in every instance of credible allegations of war crimes, the government's default position is to actively cover it up and give the suspected war criminals even more power while you viciously intimidate, hunt down, torture, and prosecute the whistleblowers, what do you think is going to happen? You reward the war criminals with promotions, high-paying jobs as corporate lobbyists or executives, or even as a pundit on mainstream media, while the whistleblowers, on the other hand, who tried to expose the truth, get smeared, their reputations ruined, and the US government coming after them with the full force of the law. These are the perverse incentive structures set up when the military-industrial complex is setting US foreign policy. Their hatchet men, their mercenaries will always be protected legally and taken care of financially, but anyone who threatens to stop the gravy train by exposing the war crimes, they are public enemy number one. So it will be interesting to see how this trial turns out, but this is a systemic problem that can only be addressed by getting private money out of politics to get rid of the incentive for endless war. Then we need to end these wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen. I'm not sure if I said that already. And there needs to be serious war crimes investigation of people who've been running the show, like Gina Haspel and John Bolton and Mattis and George Bush and Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Obama and the Clintons. This is a crazy story, and it's very telling that the default position from our government when it comes to war crimes is, everybody come on, let's get together and figure out a way that we can cover this shit up